he vanished into the jungle without a trace. For years, his name faded. Just another mystery swallowed by time. But then, decades later, someone found the film. Grainy, forgotten, almost discarded. In one frame, a war canoe, gliding silently downriver, men painted in ritual, and among them, a white figure. His face was calm, his eyes locked with the lens. Was it Michael Rockefeller? Or something that used to be? Michael Rockefeller was not your typical 23-year-old. He was the heir to one of America's most powerful families, a family synonymous with wealth, influence, and legacy. As the son of Nelson Rockefeller, the U.S. Vice President and four-term governor of New York, Michael could have easily lived a life of comfort, defined by privilege and prestige. But privilege wasn't enough. For Michael, there was a restless pull, a need to go further, to understand something beyond the world he'd inherited. While others in his position might have leaned into the effortless predictability of such a life, Michael was determined to push boundaries. What fascinated him most were the remote cultures that seemed untouched by the modern world. And perhaps no culture captivated him more than the Asmat tribe of Dutch New Guinea, a group living in an untamed land that was almost as enigmatic as they were. They thrived in one of the most isolated and impenetrable regions of the planet, where thick mangroves choked the shoreline and rivers wove like veins through dense, steamy jungles. For centuries, the Asmat were rarely contacted by outsiders. Their way of life was preserved in its rawest form. Their rituals, their art, and most of all, their spiritual belief systems operated on ideas vastly removed from anything Michael had encountered in homegrown American modernity. But to Michael, these elements weren't just curiosities. They were windows into the human experience, and he wanted to immerse himself completely. The Asmat people, above all, were known for their intricate art and carvings, particularly the bispoles. These were towering, almost ghostly wooden sculptures, carved as tributes to the dead. Each pole told its own story, representing the spirits of warriors and ancestors, figures leaving this world but calling to be avenged. These poles weren't just decorative objects. They carried deep spiritual weight, woven into a belief system that tied the living and the deceased in a cycle of balance, revenge, and renewal. To Rockefeller, this was culture in its purest form, both beautiful and terrifying. What might appear macabre to an outsider struck him as profoundly meaningful. His curiosity wasn't just a passing intellectual interest. It became an obsession. Michael was determined to bring this world closer to his own, willing to risk the dangers of crossing oceans to achieve it. His fascination with tribal art and artifacts had already drawn him to the region weeks earlier, during what was supposed to be a short visit. In 1961, he set out with a team from Harvard's Peabody Museum on an anthropological expedition, but it quickly became apparent that Rockefeller's interest went beyond academic inquiry. He wasn't just documenting, he was collecting, as if driven by a need to preserve the vanishing traces of these ancient societies before they slipped away entirely. During the trip, he acquired numerous works of tribal art, much of it destined for the Museum of Primitive Art in New York City, an institution his father had co-founded. The artifacts he brought back were more than representations of Asmat culture. To Michael, they were pieces of a puzzle, objects that could be studied, understood, and preserved for a world that might otherwise forget they ever existed. But for Rockefeller, it wasn't enough to interact with these relics in a museum context. He yearned to experience their essence among the people who created them. As much as he wanted to bring the Asmat world into his own, there was an undeniable sense that he also wanted to leave his world behind, even if just for a brief moment. Of course, the Asmat weren't just another indigenous group tucked neatly into a textbook. Their rituals were deeply misunderstood and in many ways feared by outsiders. Historically, they were notorious for headhunting, a practice with deep spiritual underpinnings. Westerners often focused on the violence, overlooking its symbolic role in maintaining harmony between the spiritual and physical worlds within the tribe's belief system. Reports of cannibalism further alienated the Asmat in the popular imagination, though the practice, if it occurred, was rooted less in barbarity and more in cultural rituals tied to the dead. Michael, however, didn't seem to share this fear or revulsion. The grittiness and danger of the Asmat way of life didn't repel him. It intrigued him. During his earlier expeditions, Rockefeller had seen enough to know just how far removed this world was from the one he'd grown up in. He'd waded through tangled mangroves and slept beneath mosquito nets in makeshift riverside camps, bearing the heat and swarms of insects relentlessly testing his limits. And yet, these physical discomforts seemed insignificant in his pursuit of something greater. His journals revealed an almost romantic determination to lose himself in these experiences, to grasp the threads of something ancient and uncharted. He wanted, it seemed, to understand human existence in its rawest, purest form. In October of 1961, having returned briefly to America, Michael decided to embark on yet another journey to the Asmat region, this time to collect artifacts and make deeper connections with the people there. It wasn't enough to observe them from a distance anymore. He wanted to be among them, to witness their reality firsthand. Experts warned him of the obvious risks: disease, isolation, and even the volatility of intertribal dynamics. But for Rockefeller, the warnings only seemed to fuel his desire further. He saw it as an opportunity, a mission even, to capture something on the brink of disappearing forever. The Asmat coastline, remote and wild, often resisted outsiders. The dense jungle wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a psychological one, separating those who belonged from those who didn't. But Michael didn't see it that way. Perhaps he believed that his willingness to respect their culture would protect him, that his understanding would somehow grant him access to a space otherwise off-limits to men like him. These were dangerous assumptions. But Michael, driven by the intensity of his obsession, either refused to acknowledge this or chose to minimize the risks. Everyone who knew him described him as quiet and understated. He wasn't the bravado-filled explorer charging into the unknown. He approached it with careful curiosity, guided more by a cerebral intensity than recklessness. But even careful explorers can miscalculate, especially when the terrain isn't just foreign, it's hostile to outsiders. And the Asmat didn't necessarily welcome intrusions, no matter how well-meaning. By mid-November, Michael had immersed himself in collecting as much as he could. Photographs from the time show him standing awkwardly with village elders, his tall frame and pale skin a striking contrast to the Asmat people around him. He listened intently as translators relayed explanations of their practices. He studied the carvings with meticulous care. To Rockefeller, it was art, complex, layered, vibrant. But to the Asmat, each carving served a purpose that went far beyond aesthetics. They weren't merely objects, they were living connections to their ancestors, infused with spirits. His final journey, though ambitious, became the tipping point. By November 17th, Rockefeller and his Dutch guide René Wassing had made their way into the region by catamaran. They'd grown accustomed to navigating by river, watching jungle canopies stretch endlessly in every direction. But the quiet inevitability of danger loomed. Almost every stretch of shoreline carried the potential for disaster, whether through hazardous currents, lurking crocodiles, or territorial tribes. It was the type of environment that punished even the smallest mistakes. Michael's obsession had brought him to the edge, the literal edge of civilization. Now, standing at the crossroads between a world he knew and one cloaked in unyielding mystery, he made his decision to push forward. Whatever might come, he saw this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and he wasn't willing to let it slip away. But the jungle doesn't forgive overconfidence. and the Asmat don't forget the past. In the days ahead, his relentless curiosity would lead him far deeper than he'd ever gone before, both literally and figuratively. What brought Michael Rockefeller here wasn't just his fascination. It was an almost insatiable need for answers. But what happens when your drive to understand something pulls you into a world you can't fully control? And more importantly, what happens after the last time anyone sees you at all? Rock gently in the waves, the sun relentlessly beating down as Michael Rockefeller and Renee Wassing clung to the overturned hull. The calm of the morning sea contrasted sharply with the growing realization that they were stranded. The boat, a patchwork vessel assembled from 2 canoes and a motor, had faltered the day before, its engine overwhelmed by the churning, unpredictable waters of the Arafura Sea. Now, the vast expanse of ocean stretched in every direction, the distant shore barely visible on the horizon. It all began on November 18, 1961, a day that should have been like any other on Michael's expedition. He and Wassing had been navigating one of the countless rivers that bled into the sea along the southern Dutch New Guinea coast. The area was wild and remote, the kind of place where even experienced travelers were considered at the mercy of nature. As their boat ventured further, it entered a chaotic meeting point of water, where the river clashed with the open sea, its currents unpredictable and dangerous. Not long after, the boat began to take on water. Failed completely, Michael, Wassing, and their 2 Asmat guides, Simon and Leo, tried to bail out the rising water with buckets, but the waves worked faster than they could, the ocean forcing itself into the vessel with each surge. Eventually, Simon and Leo decided to abandon the sinking craft, slipping into the water and swimming toward the distant coast. For Michael and Wassing, the decision wasn't as simple. The shoreline wasn't 5 or even 10 minutes away. It was miles out, obscured by the shimmering heat and haze of the horizon. To swim for help in those conditions wasn't just a risk, it was a gamble with death. Still, the 2 men stayed with the capsizing boat, hoping another vessel might cross their path. The day dragged on into the unforgiving darkness of night. Time slowed in the vast emptiness, the only sounds the splashing of distant waves and the rustle of wind across the sea. They tied themselves to the upturned hull with ropes to avoid being swept away during moments of exhaustion. Above them, stars speckled the inky sky, their brilliance doing little to counter the overwhelming sense of smallness and isolation. November 19, the situation had grown increasingly dire. The sun emerged once more, blazing down on their exposed skin. Dehydration and fatigue set in. It was here, facing another day lost at sea, that Michael made his decision. He turned to Wassing and declared, "I think I can make it." The words weren't dramatic. They were quiet, almost resigned, as if this was more an inevitability than a plan. He secured a simple gas canister to his waist for buoyancy, stripped off excess clothing, and prepared to swim. Wassing, concerned and increasingly desperate, tried to dissuade him. He knew the risks: distance, powerful currents, and whatever lurked in the water between them and the shore. But Michael was resolute. For him, inaction may have felt like a slow death. Besides, what other option did they have? Simon and Leo hadn't returned. The only boat in sight was the one they were already clinging to, its twisted shape continuing to drift aimlessly under the morning sun. Michael didn't look back as he slipped into the water, the heat of the sun replaced by the cool shock of the waves. The horizon ahead was deceiving, a shimmering line that seemed to waver and move as the sea rose and fell. Each stroke propelled him forward, but the distance he covered felt immeasurable against the endless expanse. Behind him, Wassing could only watch in growing despair as Michael's figure grew smaller and smaller, eventually swallowed by the horizon and the curvature of the earth. The Asmat coast was no ordinary shoreline. To make it to land, Michael wouldn't just have to battle the distance. He'd have to contend with various natural and unseen dangers. The waters of the Arafura Sea were known for their treacherous currents, which could pull even the strongest swimmers out into deeper waters. It was also a region home to predators like saltwater crocodiles, ancient, silent hunters who watched from beneath the surface. Even beyond the ocean, the jungle that bordered the coast was a formidable barrier in itself. Thick mangroves choked the edges of the rivers, the earth turning to heavy mud that could swallow a person's legs whole. And somewhere deeper inland was the Asmat world, a culture that outsiders did not, and could not, truly understand. Hours passed. Vossing clung helplessly to the boat, his thoughts now spiraling between hope and fear. He had no idea whether Michael was still swimming, or if the currents had already swept him away. Night fell once more, and with it, the bone-deep cold that followed hours of exposure. Vossing may have wondered if Michael could survive a second evening out in open water, something he himself wasn't sure he could manage. What Michael encountered in those hours, if he made it close to the shore at all, remains a mystery. No one witnessed his disappearance. No one saw his struggle or his triumph. The only facts left were those recorded in the aftermath. On the morning of November 21st, 2 days after Michael had vanished into the ocean, an airplane spotted the overturned catamaran drifting miles from the coast. When rescuers arrived, they found Renee Vossing clinging to its edge, dehydrated but alive. Of Michael, there was no trace. The official conclusion was straightforward. Rockefeller must have drowned during the swim. It was the simplest explanation, and in many ways the most comfortable one. Drowning happens quickly and without fanfare. The sea swallows bodies and buries its secrets deep. But not everyone was convinced. The Asmat guides, Simon and Leo, had reached the shore, but what knowledge they carried about the events that followed, or about Michael himself, has never been fully understood. What's more, the area remained shrouded in rumors. Whispered accounts began to trickle through missionary circles and Asmat villages. A white man had been seen making his way inland. Whether out of kindness or unease, few spoke loudly about what they'd seen. Search teams scoured the coastline and waterways for days following Michael's disappearance. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Boats patrolled rivers. Experts speculated on strong currents and drop-off points. His family poured resources into the operation, sparing no expense in what eventually became one of the most extensive and well-funded searches for any missing person of the time. Yet, no body was ever found. No clothing washed ashore. Nothing tangible surfaced to explain those last fateful hours. And then, there were the locals, the ones whose whispers carried a different version of the story. Instead of drowning, they said, Michael had washed up on shore. He had been seen, alive and moving on Asmat territory. At first, these rumors were dismissed. They were too vague, too fueled by speculation, handed off among missionaries and Dutch officials like a game of telephone. The colonial government wasn't interested in entertaining a narrative that could cast shadows over their relationships with indigenous groups. Yet, as the years passed and stories persisted, the official version of events began to feel unfinished. It wasn't that people doubted Michael had disappeared. They doubted it was the sea that had taken him. The simple statement Michael had made to Renee Vossing, "I think I can make it," echoed through every recounting of the event. It carried with it a sense of resolve, but also a quiet recklessness. The kind of determination born not from confidence, but from desperation. What drove him to believe he could cross a stretch of ocean others would deem impossible? Was it resourcefulness? Overconfidence? A refusal to believe his situation had no solution? In his final known moments, Michael had disappeared into the waters between worlds, one rooted in the safety of his own influence, and the other steeped in a wilderness that followed no rules. When the search teams left and the whispers began, the mystery around him only grew. Could he have survived long enough to reach the land he had so deeply yearned to understand? And if so, did the land, and the people on it, decide that he belonged to them? The jungle has a way of keeping its secrets. For months after Michael Rockefeller disappeared, the whispers began. They started in the small villages scattered across the Asmat region, passed down in quiet conversations by people who lived close to the rivers and mangroves. Rumors of a white man, still alive, emerged. Some villagers said he had been seen moving inland, deep within the dense, sweltering rainforest that surrounded their territories. For those familiar with the region, the idea almost made sense. If Rockefeller had survived the swim to shore, he would have been entering a world entirely unlike his own. But what did those whispers really mean? And more troubling, why did so many people seem to turn away from them? These accounts were often fragmented, little more than fleeting remarks from those who lived far beyond the reach of the cities and colonial settlements. They weren't reliable in the traditional sense. There was no paper trail, no concrete evidence to support them. A missionary in the area recorded hearing from locals that a white man came from the sea and never left, an almost ghostly phrase that raises more questions than it answers. Yet even as Western authorities insisted that Rockefeller was lost to the ocean, the stories refused to disappear. Villagers claimed to have glimpsed him traveling between small tribal hamlets, his appearance strange but recognizable. Others suggested he had been taken in by an Asmat community, though whether by force or by choice was left unsaid. The country itself made verification difficult. Dutch New Guinea in the early 1960s was a region as untamed as it was inaccessible. The coastline where Rockefeller vanished wasn't a single stretch of open beach. It was a broken latticework of rivers, mangroves, and swampy terrain. The jungle beyond those waterways formed a nearly impenetrable wall, its dense vegetation hiding dangers at every turn. In the wet season, the ground became a sucking slurry of mud, and invisible insects carried diseases capable of killing a man in days. It wasn't a place easily searched, especially not for someone who didn't want to be found, or who had something else keeping them hidden. But these challenges didn't stop the rumors. In hushed tones, missionaries and other visitors to the region hinted at seeing signs. A stray sandal here, a story passed between tribes there. One story suggested a man had indeed made it to shore, his pale skin startling those who first discovered him. Yet the nature of Asmat culture made tracking such a person nearly impossible. The tribes themselves rarely stayed in one place for long, their movements dictated by the needs of their community and the availability of resources. Outsiders would struggle even to reach the villages where these whispers emerged, let alone confirm them. Despite the intrigue, Dutch officials showed little interest in pursuing these leads. Their reluctance wasn't driven solely by the difficulties of the search. At the time, the Netherlands was already embroiled in tense negotiations with the United Nations about the future of their colonial hold over New Guinea. Admitting that Rockefeller had potentially fallen into the hands of the Asmat, or worse, that he might have been killed in a ritual act, would have triggered a political firestorm. The world's attention would have shifted to the region, jeopardizing delicate talks with both Indonesia and the international community. His fate, they decided, was better publicly sealed with the word drowned. Added to this silence was the church. Missionaries who lived among the Asmat seemed aware of the ongoing rumors, but were under pressure to avoid fueling speculation. For them, speaking openly could risk their position within local communities and draw unwanted scrutiny from colonial authorities. There was a sense that knowledge wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. In one instance, when a villager reportedly shared details about a white man seen inland, they later warned, "Don't speak. If you tell it, you'll die." The silence that followed wasn't just political, but spiritual. In Asmat lore, the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and crossing it could bring about unthinkable consequences. Adding to the plausibility of these stories was the deeper cultural context of the Asmat themselves. Their traditions were rooted in themes of balance and revenge, cycles that ensured their spiritual and social harmony. Headhunting, though misunderstood by outsiders, served a specific role within this belief system. Centuries of intertribal rivalry often involved avenging deaths through ritual killings meant to restore equilibrium. For those living in the region, violence and the sacred were intricately linked, each feeding into the other. Given the history of Dutch involvement in the region, especially a violent military raid in 1958 that left several Asmat men dead, it's not hard to imagine how Rockefeller's arrival might have felt to the tribe. He was not just an outsider, but a symbol of a power that had disrupted their lives. His interest in collecting Asmat artifacts, including the sacred bis poles, could have been seen as another breach, another act of disrespect. This aspect of Rockefeller's fate is explored in Carl Hoffman's controversial account, Savage Harvest. Hoffman suggests that Rockefeller may have been killed as part of a ritual act, his death serving a spiritual purpose for the people who claimed his life. Though the full truth remains elusive, he uncovered interviews with villagers who described scenarios that eerily fit such a conclusion. He also pointed to the Dutch government's consistent refusal to re-examine the case, which only deepened suspicions. As Hoffman pointed out, too many pieces of the story seemed to align too perfectly to ignore. But the real nightmare of Rockefeller's fate isn't just found in the whispers of violence. It's in the ambiguity, the maddening space between confirmation and denial. Sightings of a white man continued to trickle out for years, always just vague enough to be questioned, yet clear enough to spark hope or fear. One moment someone would say they had seen him, alive but changed. The next, another story would surface, hinting that his body had been consumed in a ritual intended to balance the spiritual ledger of the tribe. One never quite canceled out the other. This duality, that Rockefeller could have lived, but in a way unrecognizable, carries its own kind of horror. What did survival look like in that environment? Would assimilation into tribal life mean losing himself entirely, his identity stripped away and replaced with the framework of a deeply unfamiliar world? The whispers suggest both a haunting possibility and a quieter death, not of the body, but of the self. Still, those whispering voices remain, insistent despite the decades and the distance from that initial moment of disappearance. They echo not just from the people who claim to see him, but from the jungles and rivers that swallowed him whole. Whether he truly walked among the Asmat, leaving behind the world that shaped him, or became part of something darker and ceremonial, no one dares to say with certainty. Instead, all that's left are fragments, rumors that paint a picture but refuse to let us see it clearly. The silence from the Dutch authorities speaks as loudly as the whispers themselves. In many ways, their refusal to investigate the rumors acted as a kind of closing argument. If there was no search, there could be no truth to find. But that calculated silence doesn't clarify anything. It only adds to the mystery. What were they afraid of uncovering? And perhaps more troubling, what did they already know but choose not to share? In 1969, 8 years after Michael Rockefeller disappeared, a film crew made their way into the dense, foreign terrain of Dutch New Guinea. Their mission wasn't subtle. They were there because of him. By then, Rockefeller's story had become the stuff of distant headlines. A young heir vanished in the jungle, possibly taken by the very people whose culture he had sought to understand. Lured by the mystery of his disappearance and the whispers that persisted in the region, the crew's goal was as ambitious as it was unclear. Find any clue of Michael Rockefeller, or at the very least, capture the environment that might hold answers about his fate. Led by Adventure magazine reporter Milt Macklin, the team embarked on what must have felt like both a daring pursuit and a long shot. They carried cameras, audio equipment, and supplies intended for weeks of searching. But what exactly they expected to find was uncertain. Locals spoke cautiously, their stories filled with hesitations and ambiguities. Most people, whether indigenous or missionaries stationed in the region, had already accepted, or at least publicly claimed, that Michael Rockefeller had drowned attempting to swim to shore. Still, there were others, scattered here and there in villages along the rivers and coastlines, who shared hushed stories of a white man seen inland. Alive, they said, though changed. Macklin's crew aimed to capture it all on reel, but when their expedition ended, what they had gathered revealed nothing, at least nothing they realized at the time. The crew filmed hours of footage during their journey, much of it focused on tribal rituals, canoe making, and the general daily life of the Asmat people. They documented detailed carving processes and interviewed missionaries who had been living in the region for years. Over time, their project began to shift inward. Instead of zeroing in on Rockefeller's potential fate, the reels became a general record of an isolated culture adjusting to outside attention. The expedition produced dozens of reels, some striking, others mundane, and without a clear breakthrough to Rockefeller's case, the film was shelved. It faded into obscurity, boxed up and forgotten in a university archive, while the legend of Michael's disappearance settled back into unanswered questions. Years passed. The reels sat untouched in their stark metal cans, slowly collecting dust. At the time, no one realized the significance they might still hold. Forgotten mysteries tend to surface unexpectedly, though, and over a decade later, curiosity brought those reels back into light. A filmmaker, sifting through stacks of archival footage for a project about New Guinea's indigenous tribes, stumbled upon the expedition's recordings. At first, the boxed reels appeared no different from the countless others dotting the cramped archive shelves, random, unmarked relics of an older era of documentary filmmaking. He pulled them from their neglected corner, intrigued, but without much expectation. Reviewing the film started as a slow, almost monotonous process. Long stretches of grainy, shaky footage showed the expected scenes. Men paddling shallow canoes along mirror-still rivers, women weaving mats in the shade of palm trees, teenagers digging in swampy soil. The images were fascinating in their own way, a lens into a culture from decades before, but they didn't suggest anything extraordinary. The reels were, for the most part, a time capsule of routine. As days turned into weeks of review, the filmmaker began to think it might all amount to nothing more than an ethnographic record, interesting as history, but irrelevant to the mystery of Michael Rockefeller. That changed with a single reel. It was unlabeled, like all the others, containing footage shot from a canoe as it drifted calmly downriver. The camera panned lazily across the murky brown water and thick green foliage lining the shore. As the lens reached the middle of the frame, the outline of another canoe came into focus on the opposite side of the river. It moved slowly, its long hull cutting through the reflective surface, almost in sync with the current. The filmmaker leaned closer to the screen as the boat grew larger and more distinct. In it were men seated in tight rows, each figure adorned with paint and beads, Asmat warriors. For a moment, it appeared to be like so many other scenes from the reels, daily life unfolding, captured by an outsider's neutral gaze. But then, the man at the front became visible. The shot is unsteady, but not so blurry that it obscures an unsettling detail. Among the warriors seated in the canoe is a single white man. The figure stands out at once, his skin darkened by the sun, but unmistakably lighter than anyone around him, casts him in sharp contrast to his surroundings. He is bearded, unkempt, and unclothed, except for tribal markings painted across his chest and arms. His body, though foreign, has echoes of the environment it occupies, lean, adapted. The camera's shaky movement captures only a few seconds of clarity before the figure in the canoe disappears from the frame. But in those few seconds, the man does something chilling. He turns toward the camera. His gaze isn't one of shock or fear, but something else entirely. His eyes meet the lens, steady and calm, as if he understands he's been seen. The filmmaker paused the frame and stared at it for a long time. Who was this man? Could it be Michael Rockefeller, presumed long dead but somehow alive among the very people he sought to understand? The resemblance was striking. Even with the deteriorated quality of the film and the grain distorting his features, there was something hauntingly familiar about him. A beard and face hardened by years in the jungle hid a great deal but not everything. The outline of who he could be peeked through the paint and time. The strangeness of this discovery wasn't in how extraordinary the shot was, but in how ordinary it seemed at first. a group of men paddling, a scene repeated in the reels dozens of times. Only in this one, there was someone no one expected. It didn't feel staged. It didn't feel like an accident either. It felt like something caught out of the corner of the camera's eye, too fleeting to notice in the moment, but impossible to ignore in hindsight. Back in 1969, the crew who filmed it never mentioned the shot. Did they miss it entirely? Or did they see the man and choose to say nothing, unsure of what they'd witnessed or unwilling to tether themselves to its implications? Even in rediscovery, the image posed more questions than it answered. Why hadn't the man in the canoe tried to call out for rescue? Did he recognize the camera? Did he recognize himself anymore? These questions rattled through academic circles and conspiratorial ones alike, spreading to anyone still consumed by the mystery of Michael Rockefeller. The shocking detail in the film came to represent the entire case. Answers that seem within reach but slide further away the closer you get. Was this truly him, alive but irreparably changed? Or was it just another layer of the myth? An eerie coincidence that fit too neatly to ignore. What's certain is this: if the man on that canoe had spoken, if he had reached out or sent word, it never crossed back to the world watching from afar. The rediscovered footage became a focal point in the renewed effort to understand Michael Rockefeller's disappearance. It wasn't proof. Too many factors could explain it away. Still, it pulled at something in those who saw it, a voice in the back of the mind whispering, maybe. How does someone disappear for years only to reappear through the faint flickers of forgotten film? Maybe this wasn't Michael Rockefeller, or maybe it was, and whoever he had once been was gone long before the camera found him. And so the frame endures, projecting questions across decades. Was the man looking at the camera pleading, warning, or simply observing? Did he belong in that canoe, or had he chosen or been forced to become something unrecognizable? With no answers, the reel gives us only this: the unnerving possibility that Michael Rockefeller didn't disappear into nothingness. Instead, the jungle swallowed his identity, leaving behind only a quiet, inscrutable figure staring back through the lens. The man's face was barely visible. Grainy and mottled with the imperfections of aging film, the frame couldn't give a perfect image, but it did give just enough. The outline of his features, the curve of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders as he rested in the canoe, it all looked strange, and yet, somehow, familiar. He sat among the Asmat warriors, motionless but present, his body painted with the same markings as theirs, his posture calm, almost resigned. To someone watching casually, it might not have stood out, but to the filmmaker who rediscovered it decades later, there was no mistaking the shock of seeing a man so out of place and yet so eerily composed. It didn't take long for speculation to ignite. The resemblance between the man in the reel and Michael Rockefeller was impossible to ignore. The soft features of Rockefeller's younger photographs had clearly grown harsher, perhaps weathered by time and exposure to a life outside the one he had been born into. But there were unmistakable similarities. The high cheekbones and the shape of the nose were all familiar. His frame looked lean, as if shaped by years of physical endurance in a harsh environment, but it showed unmistakable signs of being someone who wasn't naturally born to that landscape. In this grainy image, many saw Michael Rockefeller, and they wondered if he had indeed survived those fateful moments in 1961, only to resurface years later in a world so different from the one he left behind. The context of the discovery swept through circles of academics, history enthusiasts, and conspiracy theorists alike. This discovery wasn't just another rumor passed around by jungle villagers or missionaries. It was here, preserved in an actual frame of film, something visual that could be scrutinized. Yet the proof that many yearned for was maddeningly out of reach. Part of the problem lay in the very nature of the footage. The film was old, weathered, and jittery. Any attempt to isolate the frame and enhance or zoom in on the image added distortions rather than clarity. No matter how long someone stared, there was always the frustrating sense that something definitive lay just out of reach, as though hidden beneath layers of grain and shadow. Experts were called in to evaluate the footage, and comparisons between the man's features and Michael Rockefeller's known photographs were painstakingly drawn. Specialists studied the man's bone structure, the shape of his skull, and other identifying characteristics. Some argued that the evidence was compelling, enough to at least consider the possibility that this could be Rockefeller. Just as many dismissed it, cautioning against jumping to conclusions. The structural similarities were, they said, circumstantial at best. With the quality of the film being what it was, they couldn't rule out that this might simply be another facially similar person from a nearby region who had somehow adopted the customs of the Asmat. Or perhaps the resemblance was just coincidence, no more significant than seeing patterns in clouds. These debates didn't stop the flood of questions. If this man was indeed Michael Rockefeller, what was his situation in the footage? Was he a prisoner of the Asmat, carried between tribes as some kind of living trophy? There were accounts that suggested it was a possibility. Historically, white outsiders were rarely, if ever, seen traversing Asmat territory, particularly alongside the tribes themselves. Could he have been captured, his survival wholly dependent on the whims of his captors? Or was there a darker possibility? That he had become a pawn in their ritualistic practices, a victim left alive only to fulfill some cultural role? But then, there was the other theory, the one that felt even harder to grapple with. What if he wasn't a prisoner? What if he was a willing member of the tribe, or had no choice but to assimilate so completely that he became, in essence, one of them? The marks painted on his skin, tribal designs, weren't hastily drawn, nor did they suggest someone who was being paraded against his will. They were perfect, deliberate, speaking to an internal logic that likely couldn't be understood by an outsider. Tribes like the Asmat prized belonging and cultural integration heavily. To carry those marks was to carry something sacred. If Rockefeller bore those marks, what did that mean? Had he chosen them? Accepted them? His expression, too, layered the mystery further. The gaze he cast toward the camera wasn't panicked or pleading. It wasn't the look of someone trying to send a hidden signal or beg for help. Instead, he appeared resolute, or perhaps indifferent, calm. He looked directly at the lens as though meeting the gaze of the person behind it, but offered no indication of what he wanted or who he even considered himself to be. Was this evidence of someone who had fully assimilated, leaving behind the identity he once had? Or was it the gaze of someone trapped, knowing there was no escape, but resigned to whatever role had been thrust upon him? Academics who study the footage have since called it one of the most tantalizing pieces of Rockefeller's mystery. It's powerful yet maddeningly inconclusive. Even those who dedicate their lives to studying cultural assimilation can only guess what the psychological journey of a man like Rockefeller might have looked like. They speculate that, if he survived, his only chance at living would have been to immerse himself so deeply into the Asmat culture that his previous self, his identity as Rockefeller, would have been unrecognizable, even to him. Over time, the human brain adapts to survive, forming bonds and creating rationalizations for the new reality. He wouldn't have just lived among the Asmat. He would have had to become Asmat. But speculation aside, anyone reviewing the footage couldn't escape the central haunting fact. The man in the canoe, painted and silent, was there. He existed in that moment, staring back at time through the frame of a forgotten reel. That knowledge alone reignited the search for answers in new and unexpected ways, from new interviews with local villagers to forensic studies of archival images. And yet, every new avenue seemed to hit an insurmountable wall. No Asmat people who were interviewed decades later confirmed his existence outright, but some hinted at a white man who walked with us or came from the sea. Were these connections legitimate, or were they misunderstandings fueled by outsider interpretations of their oral histories? By the time the rediscovered film was introduced to the public, it had taken on a larger-than-life quality. It wasn't just a visual artifact, it was a symbol of everything about this case that made it so chilling, so uniquely unresolved. The man in the canoe illustrated a core fear about human identity. It wasn't the terror of death or disappearance. It was the terror of being found again, but completely changed, as though the passage of time and circumstance had erased everything definable about who you were. If this was Michael Rockefeller, could he even be called Michael Rockefeller anymore? At what point does the person vanish entirely, leaving behind only echoes and shadows? The debate over the film, now spanning decades, still couples intrigue with unease. There's no definitive resolution, no proof that can pull the mystery neatly into the lines of a single explanation. What remains is the haunting figure in the canoe, a face in the crowd who looks straight into the camera, unafraid and unreadable. Was he reaching out? Or was he looking back at a world he no longer belonged to, quietly marveling at how far away it had become? More hauntingly, maybe he wasn't looking for anything at all. If the footage tells us anything, it's that not all mysteries scream to be solved. Some prefer to linger, quiet and unresolved, leaving behind just enough to remind us how much we still don't know. Behind the lens, that day was a man who might have held all the answers. And yet, all he gave us was the image of a white face in a passing canoe, painted in unfamiliar symbols. Staring, not pleading, but living. Living in a way no one fully understood. When Michael Rockefeller arrived in the Azmat region, he entered a world where actions, objects, and even death itself carried meanings he couldn't possibly grasp. The Azmat lived in what seemed like a boundless jungle, yet their society operated on a tight balance between the physical and the spiritual. This wasn't a place where death simply happened. It demanded action. The spirits of the dead lingered, unsettled, until those responsible for their deaths paid a price. This belief tied into one of the tribe's most infamous practices: headhunting. Outsiders fixated on the violence of it, but to the Azmat, it was about much more. It was about restoring balance. Headhunting wasn't senseless brutality. It was a deeply integral ritual that came with layers of cultural weight. Loss, especially in battle, created a spiritual imbalance. The Azmat believed the spirits of their fallen warriors couldn't rest until their deaths were avenged. To them, revenge wasn't just an act of justice, it was an obligation. By taking the head of an enemy, they believed the spirit of the lost could be pacified, and the living could return to harmony with the unseen. This wasn't just a war tactic, it was a fundamental way of life. And it was a way of life that Rockefeller, no matter how deeply he immersed himself, would never truly belong to. Central to these practices were the extraordinary bis poles. Towering wooden carvings, intricate and otherworldly, seemed to tell stories through every curve and notch in the wood. To an anthropologist or collector, they were breathtaking works of art. But to the Azmat, they were vessels of power and meaning. Each pole was linked to the spirit of a fallen warrior, tethering the dead to the living until the necessary revenge was carried out. They were not trophies, they were spiritual tools, and the thought of removing one from its place in the tribe's sacred rituals could be seen as nothing short of desecration. Rockefeller likely saw these carvings as masterpieces of human expression, but to the Azmat, even his admiration was an intrusion. Michael Rockefeller's earlier trips to the region had already created ripples of unease. During one visit, he'd attempted to barter for a bis pole, an offer that offended the Azmat elders deeply. To them, it wasn't just an insult, it was a reflection of everything wrong with outsiders. Here was a privileged American, carelessly assuming that money or trinkets could buy what was, in their eyes, sacred. The poles weren't for sale. To take one would strip its meaning, reducing a living artifact of their culture into just another item for display in foreign museums. The elders remembered Rockefeller's attempt, and resentment quietly simmered long after his departure. Then there was the unresolved wound of 1958. 3 years before Michael arrived, Dutch colonial forces had raided several Azmat villages, killing multiple men in a show of control. To outsiders, it may have been politics, But to the Asmat, it was personal. Their warriors had been killed, their spirits left unavenged. And if there's one constant among the Asmat, it's that spirits don't forget. It created a spiritual imbalance that lingered over the entire region. The loss of those men called for action, revenge to restore harmony. This wasn't debatable in their culture. It was necessary. According to Carl Hoffman's research in Savage Harvest, these threads, resentment toward Rockefeller, the desecration of their culture, and the need for revenge after the 1958 killings, all collided when Michael returned in 1961. His arrival wasn't random. He had pushed deeper into the Asmat world than ever before, driven by his fascination with their rituals and life. But what he saw as immersion, they may have seen as intrusion. To the Asmat, Michael Rockefeller wasn't just a curious young man from a distant land. He was a white outsider, and, more importantly, a representation of the colonial powers that had wronged them. He became more than an individual. He became a symbol. Hoffman's controversial account suggests that Michael's death was both deliberate and ritualistic. Villagers he interviewed claimed the decision to kill Rockefeller wasn't made lightly. It followed strict traditions and spiritual logic. The chilling consensus was that Rockefeller was chosen as a stand-in for the colonial forces responsible for the deaths in 1958. The elders of the tribe, recognizing him, came to the decision with solemn purpose. The white man was taken. He was killed for balance. One statement recorded by Hoffman reads, "It was a simple but heavy declaration that tied Michael's fate to the spiritual needs of the Asmat. He wasn't killed out of malice or chaos. He was killed to set things right." The execution itself, as described in Hoffman's book, wasn't just an act of violence. It was a ritual of powerful significance. It began with chanting, specific to the act of taking a life for spiritual purposes. Horns were blown, their haunting sounds carrying across the water, signaling that something profound was about to occur. Once the chanting came to an end, the canoes moved toward a clearing along the shore, where the act took place, surrounded by the weight of ceremony. Hoffman's account described Rockefeller being stabbed and dismembered, his body ritually consumed, as was customary to honor and fully integrate the spirits of those taken for vengeance. For the Asmat, this act of ritual violence would have restored what they saw as a broken balance. By killing Michael Rockefeller, they believed they avenged their ancestors and appeased their spirits, ensuring harmony within the tribe. But there was another layer to the tragedy, one that revealed just how deeply cultural misunderstandings played into Rockefeller's fate. From the perspective of the Asmat, their actions were not only justified, but entirely necessary. From Rockefeller's perspective, his attempt to engage with their culture, to learn from it, and even admire it, was meant as a gesture of connection, not a threat. But those intentions may have been impossible for the tribe to see, clouded by their own grief, anger, and way of understanding the world. To many in the Asmat, Michael's very presence may have felt like the final straw in a long series of violations against their people and their way of life. He represented wealth and privilege, someone who came from an industrialized world where wars were fought not with spears or rituals, but with technology and indifference. To Rockefeller, the bispoles and artifacts he sought were art, meant to be shared with the wider world. But to the Asmat, they were sacred objects that held the spirits of their people. It wasn't admiration they saw in his attempts to trade for them. It was insult. All of this paints a tragic picture of two worlds that collided with devastating consequences. The Asmat didn't see a young man drawn by fascination. They saw a trespasser, someone wrapped up in the same forces that had wronged them before. And for Rockefeller, his inability to fully understand their perspective might have sealed his fate. His relentless curiosity about a world so different from his own, combined with his underestimation of the delicate tensions at play, put him on a collision course with a system of belief that would ultimately consume him, both figuratively and, as some say, literally. Carl Hoffman's account, while compelling, remains controversial. Some argue his evidence is circumstantial at times, woven together from fragmented oral histories and difficult-to-verify statements from villagers decades after the fact. Still, it aligns with established Osmat customs, painting a picture that feels uncomfortably plausible. Hoffman argues that Rockefeller's death wasn't random, but part of a methodical and ritualized response to an unresolved injustice. The elders nodded in agreement, Hoffman recounts, describing their collective decision to act against Rockefeller. It wasn't a hasty act, it was deliberate, ceremonial. But does this explanation tell the whole story? Or is it simply one layer of a mystery too complex to ever fully unravel? The Asmat rituals, rich with meaning and history, provided a framework for the tragedy, but they don't capture everything. Was there more to the act? Did personal grievances or misunderstandings fuel the decision further? Or was Rockefeller's death just an inevitability the moment he entered their world? Why would such a simple explanation, Michael Rockefeller drowned, persist so strongly when so many other stories hovered just beneath the surface? Almost from the beginning, the official response to Rockefeller's disappearance felt strangely restrained. It was a tragedy, true, but one that came with no surprises, no unusual twists. Barely any details about the search or his last moments were made public. Officials pointed to strong ocean currents and the overwhelming odds against his survival. Yet quietly, rumors from the jungle told a different story. For some reason, those rumors never made their way to the wider audience. They were stifled, or worse, ignored altogether. The Dutch colonial administration moved quickly to settle the narrative. To them, the drowning story wasn't just plausible, it was useful. At the time, the Netherlands controlled Dutch New Guinea, but not without resistance. The region was politically fragile, caught between the Dutch colonialists and Indonesia, which was pressuring for control of the territory while the United Nations attempted to mediate negotiations. For the Dutch, any disruption that highlighted instability or worse, violence between indigenous people and outsiders, could shatter their already tenuous grasp. The region was already fragile, and the death of Michael Rockefeller, the American son of a prominent family, threatened to tip that balance. In the weeks following his disappearance, Dutch authorities ensured their version of events became the only version. The official narrative stated that Rockefeller had likely drowned while attempting to swim for shore. This explanation was unprovable but neat. It absolved both the colonial presence and the Asmat people from any responsibility, sidestepping the possibility of bloodshed or conflict in the region. Behind closed doors, though, the administration seemed far less confident. Reports emerged years later suggesting that patrol officers had discovered evidence of foul play. A skull with a puncture wound in the temple, consistent with Asmat headhunting practices. Yet this evidence never made its way to public record. Why? Because pointing fingers could have catastrophic consequences. If the Dutch admitted Rockefeller had been killed, it would not only spark outrage, but could potentially drag them into an international scandal. News of a prominent American being killed, not just killed but consumed as part of what the US and other Western nations could only describe as primitive rituals, would likely trigger demands for intervention. Such a revelation could even weaken the Dutch claim to the territory, giving Indonesia more leverage in their fight for control. In a volatile region already ripe for political collapse, the stakes for the Dutch were too high to risk letting the truth escape. But it wasn't just politics that kept officials silent. Missionaries, too, were key players in controlling the Rockefeller story, acting as intermediaries between the colonial administration and the Asmat people. In theory, they were there to spread Christianity, but their presence also served as another tool of influence in the area. Missionaries like these often knew far more about local events than the Dutch did, and they had deep, covert knowledge of the Asmat world, including their rituals and oral traditions. And yet these missionaries seemed to grow strikingly tight-lipped when Rockefeller's name came up. Some reported hearing whispers about a white man seen inland, about a strange and violent ceremony, but they offered little more than vague comments. Their hesitation wasn't just passive, it appeared calculated. At the time, missionaries operated under strict expectations not to disrupt the uneasy cooperation between the Dutch and the indigenous communities. They likely understood that speaking about Rockefeller's fate, especially if it aligned with the more gruesome stories emerging from local rumors, would attract a storm of attention and hostility. These missions depended on stability, and their own survival often hinged on not upsetting either side. Speaking out wouldn't just risk their standing in those communities, it could jeopardize lives. Subtle pressures to stay quiet could easily have turned into an informal but resolute gag order. Yet, the most chilling silences came from the Asmat region itself, where local knowledge flickered like shadows between the trees. Villagers in the area likely knew far more about what happened to Rockefeller than they let on. Some accounts tell of villagers quietly telling outsiders that the white man came or that he was taken. These fragments suggest people knew more than they revealed, but few dared say anything definitive. Part of this silence can be traced back to the incredible weight of Asmat spiritual traditions. Revenge killings carried not only spiritual power but personal danger. For an outsider, or even a member of the Asmat tribe, to speak out about such events could bring unwanted consequences or even retribution. The spirit world was not to be interfered with lightly, and the stories surrounding Rockefeller's potential fate became wrapped in that same sense of forbidden knowledge. Another reason for the muted response may have been far more immediate: pressure from colonial authorities and missionaries. Carl Hoffman's research in Savage Harvest uncovered an unsettling pattern of suppression. Dutch officials, by his account, deliberately avoided any investigation that veered toward violence or ritual killing. Those who pressed too hard on the Rockefeller case, whether they were locals, missionaries, or even other colonial officers, faced heavy social backlash or were simply silenced through intimidation. One reported incident involved a villager who provided a chilling account about the white man's death, but later swore his words came with a warning: "Don't speak. If you tell it, you'll die." What's striking is how deliberately these stories faded into the background. They weren't denied outright. They were ignored, filed away in corners, and drowned in the generic explanation of drowning. The beauty of the narrative, from the Dutch perspective, was that it asked for no further investigation. The ocean currents were dangerous, the shoreline far. Rockefeller drowned, that was the end of it. No one needed to question the Asmat, examine the possible connections to their rituals, or scratch too deeply in an already volatile region. The story could sit comfortably, without poking a much larger political bear. But the simplicity of drowning couldn't erase the whispers. And while official accounts stayed startlingly quiet, rumors gained momentum elsewhere. Hoffman's work uncovered years of testimony offered by missionaries, villagers, and even Dutch patrol officers willing to speak decades later in hindsight. The picture built from their accounts was far more troubling than any accidental drowning. This wasn't a case of an innocent man losing his life to natural forces. It was a politically charged and spiritually tangled event, manipulated by powers that didn't want the world to see how far things had truly gone. Perhaps the most uncomfortable question is this: who benefited from Rockefeller's disappearance, being dismissed so quickly? In hindsight, nearly every institution involved gained something by leaving his story unfinished. The Dutch avoided a scandal that could have shaken their grip on New Guinea. The missionaries kept the fragile balance of their positions intact. Even Rockefeller's family, wrapped in grief, seemed content to let sleeping dogs lie, perhaps wary of what political implications could ripple from pressing too hard. The only ones who may have lost in this silence were the Asmat themselves, who were quietly flattened into caricatures of fear and suspicion by the unspoken accusation hanging over their heads. But the refusal to confront the truth, or even search for it, created an eerie consequence. The silence left a void, and that void was filled by rumors, conspiracies, and haunting images, like that of the man in the canoe staring calmly into the camera. This didn't feel like closure. It felt like avoidance, a way to box up and bury something too messy, too complex, and too human to deal with fully. The suppression of information about Rockefeller wasn't just about protecting reputations or territory. It became something larger, a reminder of how systems wield power not just through action, but through intentional inaction. The drowning story wasn't an answer. It was a decision, a way to remove difficult questions and save face. Whether or not it concealed the darker truth buried in the jungle is something only a handful of people likely ever knew. And yet the silence didn't bring peace. Rockefeller's legacy was no neater for all the careful restraint. Instead, it left a lingering unease, a sense that some truths are too dangerous to speak, but too persistent to vanish. That unease remains. The jungle keeps its secrets, but the silence left behind feels like something alive, waiting endlessly at the threshold of human understanding. Decades after Michael Rockefeller disappeared, a strange phrase began circulating among the Asmat people. Quiet, almost cryptic, it carried both weight and mystery. He walked with the spirits. It was whispered like a riddle, passed down through conversations and oral traditions, offering fragments of a story no outsider could fully comprehend. Who was this white man the villagers spoke of, appearing in their memories and fading just as quickly? And more pressing, was it him? Over the years, scattered testimonies filtered out of the jungle. Some villagers claimed they had seen a white man among the Asmat long after Rockefeller was thought to be dead. They spoke cautiously, their words heavy with mystery and unease. To them, details about his presence were more implied than explicit, blurred by time and wrapped in layers of cultural meaning. The white man came, some said. He walked with us. Others described him as a figure at the edge of their world, neither entirely present nor wholly absent, someone who had crossed over into something undefinable. These accounts weren't often clear, and each telling seemed to shift slightly, as though the edges of the story refused to stay sharp. Separating fact from myth in these stories was almost impossible, particularly given the Asmat's reliance on oral traditions. Unlike written records, oral histories are alive. They evolve with each retelling. They're shaped not just by the memory of events, but by the beliefs and cultural context of the people passing them down. For the Asmat, the rigid distinction between the physical and spiritual worlds didn't exist the way it does in Western thinking. Their worldview blurred these boundaries, creating a space where the dead and the living, the real and the symbolic, all intersected. This perspective was woven into the stories they told about the white man's presence in their midst. To the Asmat, the question of whether he was real, in the way outsiders understood reality, might not have even mattered. What did matter was the meaning they assigned to his existence, or his transformation. Some villagers described him as a figure who had crossed over, a phrase that suggests more than just physical survival. To walk with the spirits carried profound significance in Asmat culture. It implied that this person had not just lived among them, but had somehow entered their spiritual realm, becoming part of the sacred cycles that governed their understanding of life and death. Whether this transformation was seen as voluntary or something imposed on him by the tribe's rituals was left unsaid, but the implications were undeniable. If the white man had indeed crossed over, then he was no longer Michael Rockefeller in any recognizable sense. He was something else, something tied not to his home or family, but to this world of jungle, spirits, and ritual. Of course, these stories weren't consistent. Other villagers offered more practical explanations for the white man's presence. Was he alive and lurking somewhere within the tribe, sustained by the need to survive? Some accounts painted him as an outsider who had been captured but spared, living under the control of the Asmat as either a servant or an oddity. In this version, he remained physically alive but isolated, trapped in a life completely alien to anything he'd known before. And yet even these pragmatic interpretations were tinged with spiritual overtones. To the Asmat, even captivity wasn't just about power, it was about maintaining balance. Was he a prisoner in the physical sense, or was he bound in ways far more complex, trapped perhaps by the invisible forces that governed their cultural beliefs? The accounts of the white man endured with all their contradictions and ambiguities, carried along not just as memories but as cultural narratives. Oral storytelling is the heartbeat of Asmat society, a way to pass knowledge, values, and warnings across generations. But it's also fluid, with details shifting and reshaping as time moves forward. One version of a story might focus on the white man's strangeness, his inability to fully belong, while another could link him directly to the spirits through ritual practices. In both cases, the storytelling reveals more than historical information. It shows how deeply the Asmat tied meaning to events, how every story held a purpose, even if that purpose wasn't immediately clear to outsiders. Over time, these shifting accounts only deepened the sense of mystery surrounding Rockefeller's disappearance. Missionaries who lived in the region sometimes heard whispers, filtered through translators, about a white man who had stayed behind. Some even tried to press the locals for more details, but the answers they received were evasive or cryptic, perhaps deliberately so. One said simply, "He came from the sea and never left." To a Western mind, the ambiguity was maddening. Did that mean he survived? Was he living among them all these years? Or was this just an echo of something larger, a way for the Asmat to speak symbolically about memory, transition, and the unknown? What's certain is that the phrase, "he walked with the spirits," lingered. It carried weight not just as a statement, but as a kind of explanation, albeit one outsiders struggled to interpret. Did it mean Rockefeller had been absorbed into their culture, reshaped by their rituals and beliefs until he was no longer an individual but part of their spiritual system? Or was it simply a poetic way of explaining his disappearance, a way to reconcile his presence in their history without holding on to the harsh contradictions of what might have happened? Either way, the phrase resisted clarity, leaving those who heard it grasping at its symbolic edges. The contrast between these fragmented stories and their possible symbolic meaning reveals another layer of complexity. For the Asmat, the meaning of an event often matters more than the event itself. The boundaries between the material and the mythical blur in their worldview, creating a context where Rockefeller's disappearance could become both a literal and a symbolic story. Like their woven myths, his presence, or even the memory of it, could be adapted to explain certain truths about their own lives and traditions. Could the stories about him represent cultural memory just as much as actual history? Perhaps his survival, or his transformation into one who walked with the spirits, reflected larger themes about belonging, balance, and the fragility of identity on the edges of their world. These ambiguities aren't new to oral storytelling, but they take on a chilling power in the context of Michael Rockefeller's life. The possibility that these stories depict actual memory is as tantalizing as it is terrifying. If he survived, if he assimilated, and if he truly walked among the Asmat, how would he have made sense of who he had become? Even if he came back to the world outside that jungle, would he still be Michael Rockefeller? Or would the person he was, a privileged young man searching for pieces of a foreign culture, have vanished entirely, devoured not by death but by a slow transformation into something neither fully Asmat nor fully American? There's another possibility, buried within the contradictions. Maybe Rockefeller didn't survive in any conventional sense. Maybe his life, his death, and his becoming are all tangled together in ways that defy simple explanation, preserved in the Asmat's oral histories as fragments of a much larger truth. These stories, "He came from the sea, and he walked with the spirits," don't just recount his disappearance. They mark his crossing into the unknown, where memory and myth blend together until they're inseparable. And so the phrase lingers, haunting in its simplicity, stark in its implications. He walked with the spirits. Maybe it's a reflection of his survival, not of his physical self, but of something deeper, an identity remade in the image of another world. Or maybe it's a metaphor, capturing the Asmat's understanding of how outsiders touch their culture and, in so doing, become part of it. Whatever the truth, these words offer no simple resolution. Instead, they leave us with questions that only grow heavier the more we consider them. Was this man, this foreigner who came seeking their secrets, finally claimed by them? Or did Michael Rockefeller step willingly into their world, letting the jungle and its spirits consume him, leaving behind a person his own family wouldn't recognize? Whatever the answer, The finality of his old life was clear in the jungle's whispers and the quiet words of those who remembered. He no longer belonged to the world he left behind. Disappearing is one thing. You leave a gap where you existed, and the world keeps moving forward. But being found changed, transformed into something unrecognizable. That's another kind of horror. What if Michael Rockefeller didn't simply die in 1961? What if instead, his identity itself disintegrated, leaving something behind that was entirely stripped of who he used to be? A young man with a famous last name, born into immense privilege, ends up swallowed by a world he couldn't fully understand. Not just a physical disappearance, but a collapse of self. That's the echo of his story, the terror of becoming something or someone else entirely. When Rockefeller made the decision to return to the Azmat, he carried curiosity and ambition, but also a dangerous lack of understanding. His fascination with their art, their rituals, their way of life, it was intense and genuine. But while he saw a culture worth preserving, the Azmat might have viewed his actions differently. To them, his collecting wasn't just disrespectful, it was invasive. These weren't just objects to be displayed in museums. The bispoles he sought were sacred tools of balance and revenge. They were tied to their ancestors, to their spirits. To remove one was to remove a piece of their world. And then there's the reality of what Rockefeller represented. He wasn't just another explorer passing through. He carried the weight of colonial power wherever he went, whether he knew it or not. Only 3 years before he arrived, Dutch forces had raided Azmat villages, killing several men. These weren't distant events. They were raw wounds. Rockefeller's presence may have rekindled that pain. To the Azmat, he wasn't simply another visitor. He was a pale-skinned symbol of those who had wronged them. And perhaps, in their eyes, he was someone who owed them a debt. When Carl Hoffman investigated Rockefeller's disappearance for Savage Harvest, he proposed a chilling possibility. Hoffman suggested that Michael's fate might have been ritualistic, tied to the Azmat system of spiritual balance. Revenge killings in Azmat culture weren't random acts of violence. They were deliberate, methodical, meant to restore harmony in their world. Hoffman's account suggests that Rockefeller, an outsider who sought to take pieces of their culture, could have been seen as the embodiment of imbalance. If he truly became part of their cycle, it's possible his death wasn't just accepted, it was inevitable. But perhaps more unsettling than death is what might have followed. If the man seen in the rediscovered film was truly Michael Rockefeller, it raises a haunting question. What happens when survival demands something far greater than endurance? What if it demands the erasure of who you are? Whether he was a captive, a participant, or something in between, the boundaries around his identity would have undoubtedly begun to blur. The Azmat way of life wasn't something an outsider could merely observe or resist. To stay among them would have required becoming part of their world, in ways that would overpower his own. There are stories, passed down quietly through Azmat oral traditions, about a white man seen in their villages. Phrases like, "he walked with the spirits," seem to suggest a transition, not just physical but spiritual. Walking with the spirits is not something taken lightly in their culture. It implies transformation, a crossing into a space where the lines between who you are and who the spirits say you should be begin to shift. For Rockefeller, if these accounts are true, survival meant becoming someone or something else. Someone stripped of the very identity that had defined him up to the moment he entered their world. The psychology of such a transformation is difficult to comprehend, but other stories of cultural collision offer unsettling insights. Consider cases of individuals who survived captivities or prolonged isolation, finding themselves immersed in foreign traditions for years. Survival often hinges on adaptation. Over time, the defining features of their old identities fade. Language changes first. Speech becomes shaped by their new surroundings. Then gestures, rituals, and beliefs follow. The mind, isolated and far from home, rewires itself to conform to a world it doesn't recognize. It's a process both natural and horrifying, as self-preservation erases former self-definition. For those individuals, returning to their original lives, if they do make it back, becomes nearly impossible. By the time they're reintroduced to the world they lost, they often no longer belong to it. If Rockefeller lived and assimilated, it's possible his transformation followed a similar path. Yet for him, the stakes were far more complex. His world and the Asmat world didn't just differ, they clashed. In their view, he may have been a necessary part of restoring spiritual balance, a being who didn't belong to either side but existed in a liminal space between them. Perhaps this was why the accounts of him were so ambiguous, why villagers described him as walking with the spirits, no longer an outsider but not fully one of them. Then there's the question of choice. Some theorize Rockefeller embraced his assimilation, realizing that there would be no way back. Others argue the opposite, that it was a slow, involuntary process, driven purely by the need to survive. There's no way to know. But either possibility leads to the same unsettling conclusion. If the man sitting in the canoe on the rediscovered film reel was indeed Michael Rockefeller, he wasn't entirely himself anymore. His body may have lived on, but his identity, the version tied to his family, his ambitions, his intentions, was gone. His story echoes another unsettling truth. The boundaries we place between ourselves and the unknown, civilization and wilderness, are far more fragile than they appear. For Rockefeller, his fascination with the Asmat had always been about those boundaries. He sought to connect, to understand, to share a piece of something ancient with the modern world. Instead, he may have discovered that such boundaries don't allow for spectators. To cross them is to lose your footing entirely. To cross them might mean surrendering to something you can't escape. And then there's the deeper irony of Rockefeller's legacy. Today, much of what the wider world remembers about him exists in the artifacts he collected. The Michael C. Rockefeller wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art displays sculptures, carvings, and relics tied to cultures like the Asmat. These items, once alive with meaning, now sit behind glass, admired for their craftsmanship, but stripped of their context. It's a sharp reminder of the very thing Rockefeller sought to avoid: cultures turned into exhibits. In a strange, almost poetic loop, it's as if Rockefeller himself mirrors these artifacts. He went in pursuit of meaning and connection, but if the accounts of his transformation are true, he became part of the culture he once sought to protect, absorbed into something that ultimately could not leave him untouched. For his family, his disappearance left a wound with no clear edges. His twin sister, Mary Rockefeller, later became a prominent grief counselor. She wrote extensively about the pain of ambiguous loss, the unique grief that comes when someone vanishes but no definitive end is ever found. This type of absence leaves behind echoes rather than answers, forcing those left behind to live alongside the uncertainty. Her work revealed that the horror of Michael's disappearance didn't just exist in the mystery. It lingered for decades, slowly reshaping the people who carried his memory. In the end, what remains most haunting isn't just the possibility that Michael Rockefeller was found again, but in a form unrecognizable to his old world. It's the idea that in becoming part of the Asmat, he may have ceased to exist entirely in the way we understand identity. It's the possibility that the man in the canoe wasn't lost in the jungle or swallowed by the ocean, but consumed by the unraveling of who he once was. And yet, what's left behind, the whispers, the fragments of film, the chilling gaze into the camera, isn't silence. It's a reminder of how fragile identity is when faced with the unknown. His story isn't just about vanishing into another world. It's about the terror of returning as someone that world has reshaped. Michael Rockefeller's disappearance is not just a mystery. It's a silence that resists resolution. The absence of answers creates a void where fear grows, not only of what happened, but of what was hidden on purpose. Suppressed evidence, hesitant whispers, and calculated inaction reveal a deeper truth. This was never just about one man lost to the jungle. It was a collision of worlds, buried beneath denial. And now, the only thing left to rise from the mangroves are the questions. And that's where the story runs out, and the silence begins. But, wherever you are right now, in bed, on a walk, or just passing the time, thank you for letting me be part of it. If you're asleep already, I'll take that as a compliment. I'll be here when you wake up, or whenever you need another story.